music making, how their links with the local community may be developed or strengthened through musical activities, and how musical instruments and sound recordings can be a significant catalyst for advocacy and social justice. Christina has been awarded a grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council for her PhD study, which will commence in September of this year. She'll be working at Bangor University in collaboration with Gwyneth Museum on Peter Crossley Holland's collection of Mesoamerican musical instruments. So, without further ado, our first paper, Ethnomusicology in Museums, Perspectives from Europe. And Christina Homer, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you to Chris and Marcia. It's a really wonderful opportunity for me, particularly because I'm between universities at the moment, trying to make my living, doing a normal job. I finished my master's studies, as Judith said, at the University of Manchester last autumn, and I'll begin my PhD this September at Bangor University in North Wales. And for this project, I'll be focusing on a collection of musical instruments from pre-Columbian Mexico, which are held at Bangor University at the moment. So in this paper, I'll give an idea of some of the associations that I found between ethnomusicology and museums. While I was researching my master's thesis, I visited 4 museums in the UK and the Netherlands in order to investigate the following questions. First, how can museums use musical instruments to provide insight into world music making? And second, to what extent do museums promote active music making? The museums I visited were the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, the Horniman in London, the Pitt Rivers in Oxford, and the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam. And each museum varies wildly in their approach to music in the museum, from dark and hushed to bright and noisy. This next section I call my holiday pictures section, so I hope you enjoy. Oh, just a little, Pitt Rivers, Horniman in London, Tropen Museum over in Amsterdam, National Museum of Scotland up in Edinburgh there. So the Pitt Rivers, this is my first visit. It's an ethnographic museum, which includes musical instruments amongst its other cultural artifacts. The Pitt Rivers is attached to the larger Natural History Museum, and it lurks at the back of the hall in a separate room with low lighting. Feels a bit like a forgotten room filled with treasures waiting to be discovered. There are glass cabinets that are stuffed with objects and very tightly spaced, so you kind of have to squeeze in between them. The museum doesn't have videos or music playing or any noise apart from what comes from the kind of large and exciting Natural History Museum next door. I hired an audio guide for my visit here, which gave my visit its own personal soundtrack, which I'll talk a bit about later. The Horniman in South London has its own musical instruments gallery, which are laid out according to narratives. So there's a long case which on one side has, it's called The Rhythm of Life, which is from birth to infancy, childhood, education, marriage, death, funeral rites. And then on the other side, there's The Ideal Sound, which charts instruments' progression from invention to manufacture to migration. It's also got quite a few whizzy interactive things going on, so a lot of videos within the display and these tables where you can kind of focus on particular instruments and play little sound recordings and things. So my next visit was to the National Museum in Scotland in Edinburgh. The instruments were collected primarily by the ethnomusicologist Jean Jenkins. The instruments are displayed in cabinets with some contextual information, but what makes the gallery special is the telling of Jenkins' story. Some of her diary entries and letters from her trips to Africa and Asia are displayed, along with a bank of her fieldwork recordings, which visitors can browse and listen to. Bringing the ethnomusicologist and her methods of collecting into the display really felt like a revelation, sort of equivalent to the watershed moment of injecting discussions of fieldwork experience into ethnography. So I don't know if that's clear, that the picture on the right-hand side there is this bank where you can browse through Jean Jenkins' diary entries and those sorts of things. So the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam. It's a really beautiful museum, really beautiful building. And it's also one that seems to have really come to terms with its origins as the Colonial Institute. The museum celebrates the diversity of contemporary Amsterdam society, but pulls no punches with the harshness of colonial rule. And this was unusual to me as a visitor of British museums. The other ones that I visited kind of barely touch on these aspects of their acquisitions. Although the Tropen Museum has a dedicated musical instruments gallery, music can be seen and heard throughout the museum as a way to enrich displays about other aspects of culture, religion and politics. And I'm just going to play you a couple of short examples. Sorry it's so quiet, but it was really quiet there as well, just kind of background music. And I'll just explain a little bit what you're seeing here. I don't know how clear it is. It's glass cabinets with mannequins dressed in various costumes with masks and things. And then there's a projector which projects these moving and still images of kind of these costumes being used in context. So the challenge facing museums today seems to centre on visitability. In what ways can museums bring objects to life, provide interactive experiences, and above all, attract visitors by offering a fun and educational experience? In parallel, the shift in attitude within ethnomusicology from the material evidence of music alone, so instruments, transcriptions and recordings, to the process and behaviour of music, warrants a more interactive approach to displaying musical instruments. The intangible concepts of process and behaviour are more difficult to display in a glass case, so museums must increasingly negotiate innovative ways of displaying musical culture. Although this seems particularly relevant to musical instruments, the problems of displaying tangible representations of intangible culture face museums for any cultural object. During my research, I thought a lot about whether musical instruments warrant separate attention from other cultural objects, and I came to the conclusion that they do and they don't. All artefacts are entwined in cultural and societal processes, but music, I think, is sometimes seen as particularly special, especially to musicians. Perhaps it's because of the transfer in medium between a musical object and a musical sound. For example, if we compare a musical instrument with a mask used in theatre or dance, a mask used in its original behaviour is visually aesthetic, complementing another visual aesthetic. However, a musical instrument has a visual aesthetic value when displayed, but its purpose is to transfer its physicality to sound via human intervention. Perhaps this is why a musical instrument silenced in a display case seems more affecting than a mask sitting behind glass, also in use. The National Museum in Edinburgh had some notable approaches to this problem. The gallery where the musical instruments reside is called Performance and Lives, and contains knickknacks from Day of the Dead festivals, flamenco costumes, videos of Balinese dance, theatre, masks, and so on. Also, they commissioned an instrument maker to make a fiddle for them, which is displayed in a glass case and has never actually been played. It was created totally to be displayed in the museum. The accompanying text even points this out to visitors, provoking philosophical musings of what constitutes a musical instrument. If a musical instrument is never played, what makes it a musical instrument? Kevin Dorr, who researches the ecology of musical instrument manufacture, encapsulates the problem of decontextualizing musical instruments. I have a quote here. So without the human interaction around the musical instrument, much of its meaning is lost. I liken the processes involved in displaying musical instruments to writing ethnography. Many of the issues are similar. If the visitor is akin to the reader, the curator is the author and must choose which parcel truth to convey. As with ethnography, the story that is chosen is based upon the author's own experiences and knowledge, and in addition, the instruments have often been collected by another agent who had their own agenda as to which instruments should be taken as representative of their culture. So these multiple layers of meaning must somehow be conveyed to the visitor in a way that makes some kind of sense. This has implications in museum display over how and where musical instruments should be displayed. In 3 of the museums that I visited, the instruments were displayed in dedicated musical instrument galleries and were supplemented with lots of contextual information about how they're used as musical instruments in their culture of origin. The Pitt Rivers has no separate gallery. In fact, the whole museum is one room, although a massive room. The musical instruments are classified generally by acoustic properties or physical material and labelled with Hornbostel sax terms. Most critics of the Hornbostel sax system would cite its cultural insensitivity. In my thesis, I used the example of what the Pitt Rivers labels a Micmac trumpet, not knowing that I was going to be presenting this research in this area of the world. So nowhere is this object attributed in its indigenous culture as a musical instrument. It's described as a musical imitator used in hunting. So I wondered, if it wasn't used to make music in its culture of origin, why has it been labelled as such in the museum? However, the Pitt Rivers more than makes up for its old-fashioned displays with innovations in other areas. As part of the University of Oxford, the museum has an ethnomusicologist on staff, Noel Lobley. Noel researched the ethnomusicologist Hugh Tracy, who provided the university with fieldwork recordings from South and Central Africa. Noel is now involved in the repatriation of many of these recordings, notably in the townships around Grahamstown, South Africa. Noel is also involved in the innovative digital sound archive project, Reel to Reel, and I just have a little explanation of what that is about. So accessibility and reciprocity are the key emphases of the university and the museum. This has led to a series of events in the museum after hours involving archival recordings as well as interactive visual and audio technologies and live musicians. For example, Inside Sounds was an interactive rainforest soundscape which combined recordings from the Central African Republic of Bayaka music with ambient sounds from the rainforest and live performance from a saxophonist who is improvising based on audience input, and a visualizer designed by the museum's composer-in-residence, Nathaniel Mann. More information about these wonderful and exciting projects can be found on their blog. And it's a real example of how museums can be involved in applied ethnomusicology, making ethnomusicological research accessible to the public, as well as aiming to benefit people in the source community. The reel-to-reel events are an example of how the Pitt Rivers includes active music making in the museum space, but the Pitt Rivers is the only museum out of the 4 that doesn't actually have music making embedded permanently in the gallery. The 3 other museums provide various ways of promoting interactivity. For example, at the Horniman, a hands-on room adjoins the instrument gallery containing replicas of some of the instruments seen in the gallery, plus some extra ones. I visited during the half-term school holiday, which meant that my visit was punctuated with the sound of 3-year-olds banging djembes as hard as they could. I'm not sure to what extent this constitutes music making. I would suggest that simply placing the instrument in front of somebody isn't so much making music as using a musical instrument to make noise. However, it's certainly encouraging a deeper participatory engagement with musical instruments, and I suppose better than nout. The National Museum of Scotland similarly has instruments dotted around which visitors are encouraged to play. With great regard for grumpy people like me, they commissioned an instrument maker to create new instruments for purpose. So the creations are made from materials which limit the sound, and it kind of just provides an ongoing gentle jangling. And they're also, interestingly, they're kind of inspired by things throughout the exhibition, but they're not actual replicas of musical instruments. They're completely new things. Also at the National Museum of Scotland, there's a bank of sample recordings of the instruments which are in the display, and it encourages you to kind of create your own compositions by using these samples. And it is, you can also try this out yourself on their website, which I forgot to put on a slide here, but if you just Google National Museum Scotland World Music Composer, you can have a go with this yourself. The Troper Museum, I think, won at interactivity, if it is a competition. They have a separate musical instruments gallery with glass cases, but they also have a lot of videos which play simultaneously with headphones attached to each one, allowing you to pick and choose between them. The videos focus on a few instruments in great detail, with the emphasis on their journey around the world through colonisation and diaspora. At the sides of the room are two booths. One is the Museum of Forgotten Songs and encourages visitors to record themselves. So there are a lot of kind of groups of teenagers recording themselves going, way! But some people are more conscientious, like me. I contributed a playground song, which was the first thing that came into my head. This playground song called In and Out the Scottish Bluebells. The other booth in this museum was a singing school where video tutorials played, teaching yodeling, Indian classical singing, or throat singing. And I have an example for you. Is there any way to increase the sound a little? Thank you.
Yeah, no.
Zoals ik al zei, maak je deze normale liedjes zoals ik laat mijn geurmerk nooit achterin. En als je dat zingt in een eigen taal, dan klinkt dat zo.
So, as you can tell, I never did learn how to do throat singing. So these activities are reminiscent of Small's concept of musicking, which defines music in terms of what it is not. That is, it's not just for listening, it's for doing. It's not just for professionals, it can extend to the amateur and the everyday. It doesn't require a particular setting, and it can be freely accessible. And most of all, it doesn't need to be passively received by an audience, but can be acted by participants. So, in conclusion, museums use musical instruments as a conduit or a physical representation of musical culture. The choices that are made as to how much visitors are exposed to are similar to the choices ethnomusicologists face when writing up their fieldwork experiences. How much contextual information to translate and how. Two of the museums that I visited acknowledged the partiality and paucity of their collections by revealing the stories of their collectors, which emphasise that the musical instruments have been disembedded in their journeys from their culture of origin to their display case. All of my example museums encourage musicking in some guise, whether allowing more physical contact with musical instruments, encouraging composition and improvisation, or bringing performance into the gallery. Museums recognise that music now means more than its physical representations. It means human behaviour, and it's a part of life. Thank you.
Just for those of you who came in after the introductions, the first presenter is not here this morning, so we've started with Christina. I think there's time for about 10 minutes of questions. If people have questions, feel free to bring them into the room. David?
Yeah, I wondered why you chose those particular 4 museums. Were you trying to get a spread of different kinds? You kind of knew more museums, but you wanted that particular sort of variety?
Yes, right? Exactly. So my research was for my master's thesis, so I had a constraint about the number of examples that I could use. So exactly that. I knew that these museums represented a spread of different ideas, but I also particularly chose musical instruments that have, museums that have what they call ethnographic collections of musical instruments. I didn't want to visit, there are millions and millions of repositories of Western classical collections. So I particularly wanted to see how museums dealt with facing, when faced with world cultures. Yeah.
I'm really interested in, I wonder what your thoughts are about the focus on instruments, and that, I mean, museums are so designed around the idea of looking at things, looking at objects.
Yeah.
And sound is something so different. So
Yeah.
how well do you feel like the museums were able to balance that idea of the object to be looked upon as opposed to hearing the sound or acting in the sound? Did the objects encourage, like, open that possibility, or do they kind of constrain people to think about music in perhaps
In
more
terms of its,
object-oriented ways?
yeah. I will just go back to my slides that show a few examples of the galleries. So the Pit Rivers is in the first camp, so the instruments are kind of displayed amongst other objects as well. So they are there to be viewed as objects. This is the museum that that happened to the greatest extent. But there was this audio guide that I mentioned, which some of the cabinets had little numbers in the corner, and it would play you some recordings of that instrument and talk a bit about the context of it. The Horniman had, so this is an example from I think the Rhythm of Life case that I was talking about. And it has the instrument, but it also has costume, and it has a video showing a little bit of information about the dance there. So it's kind of more of an emphasis on all of those things tied together. They also, this is my friend Em demonstrating the hands-on room as well. And this picture at the bottom is from an enormous case that is absolutely crammed with instruments. So I think if you are an average visitor who just wants to walk in and look around, again, it's the physical representation of music. That's what music means. But they also have these tables where you can, it focuses on, I think most of the instruments, if not all of them, and again, it has little recordings and things like that. Can I say anything more about the other museums? Yeah, and the Tropium Museum, again, is really, it's obviously been awarded a lot of funding from someone or other, because it has a lot of those similar kind of a lot of videos and a lot of, yeah, you can kind of engage with the instruments in that way as well. So the museums that I visited are sort of partially successful at kind of moving away from the idea of objectification of music. Yeah, I think it's always in balance when you're in a museum, isn't it? I don't know. Did that answer your question at all?
No, that's very helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I walked in late, so maybe you covered this. What would their reaction is if you can show some competence and you ask to play some of the instruments?
You can't do that because they're all locked up.
Well,
so,
no, I mean, you need to ask them, but I mean, obviously it needs to be arranged and stuff.
Oh, I see. So if, yeah, I mean, the National Museum of Scotland has, it also has a historical keyboard collection, and I think they have things set up where you can, yeah, if you're kind of interested in early music performance, you can try out some of their keyboards. But for the most part, yeah, I think they've kind of gone out of their way to discourage people from asking that question even. So the instruments are in the cases, and all of this contextual information around them is kind of trying to give you any other information that you might want to know.
But one of them you said had
Yeah.
replicas.
Yes, which one was that? Oh, this, the Horniman, yeah. So, the Horniman has this hands-on room, which is separate and full of annoying children. And they've kind of chosen a few of the more accessible instruments to replicate, so you can have a go at them. But I think, Eric, I kind of get the impression you mean more like if there's an instrument that, so like if you're a bassoonist and there's a really interesting kind of bassoon, maybe you want it, so you can't really pick and choose, they've sort of chosen already which instruments you can try out. And they've chosen them based on kind of their ease of manufacture, I suppose, and their kind of robustness, so that they can be played all the time. Yeah, so it's kind of chosen for you. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I didn't really think of that while I was doing my research.
I mean, that's a huge issue in the U.S. I mean, which
Yeah.
ranges from, let's say, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where they have actually de-stringed the piano.
Right, okay. Yeah.
To a piano museum in upstate New York, where they welcome you to play.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
it's also an instrument that's hard to break.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, there's also the question of, maintaining the maker's hand, or in certain contexts, the player's hand. And so
Yeah.
the reason that museums are able to educate us 200 years later is because things have been preserved, knowing that it's a valuable piece and that it's important to keep playing and know what these sounds are. But I think there's a question of conservation that comes with that.
I think, yeah, the museums, they do sort of encourage a lot, they have this kind of community music programs, and they do encourage a lot of, like they bring in musicians to do activity, like workshops for school children and things like that, so that they kind of sidestep playing the actual instruments, but you can play something similar, or play similar music on different instruments. But the sort of thing that I really want to look into in my PhD is kind of involving the manufacture of instruments, so you can make your own instruments based upon the ones in the collection, which you can then play, because the instruments that I want to look at Bangor are, some of them are 5,000 years old, they can't be played, basically, but a lot of them are kind of ocarina, that style of thing, so there's kind of a lot of scope, I think, to encourage manufacture of musical instruments, and then another output of that is that they can also be played. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Just with a view to thinking again about how to connect objects with people, I'm wondering if you found that any of these museums had any information about the instrument makers, and also Pitt Rivers in particular, which is well known for its repatriation efforts. Do they ever bring people from communities in to look at these objects and to perhaps talk a little bit about the choices of materials, the construction, all of those things?
Not that I know of, but they have, so the Bayaka communities, they have a lot of, the Pitt Rivers are kind of, to my knowledge, it's also based a lot around recordings rather than musical instruments. That's their repatriation. Yeah, but they have links with that community, and they are in conversation with them a lot. And I know that the particular event that I was talking about, Inside Sounds, had a live video link up, and so people in the Central African Republic could watch this event. I'm not sure to what extent they had input in the actual event as it was happening. What was the other part of your question? Sorry, I've forgotten.
Or whether there was any information about instrument making.
Instrument maker. Yes, sort of, a little bit. The example that I really like is at the National Museum of Scotland. There's I don't know if you were here for that bit of my talk, there's a fiddle that they commissioned somebody to make for the museum. So they kind of said, this is a fiddle that's never going to be played. We want it to be on display, kind of untouched. And so for that particular object, there is, information about this instrument maker, this fiddle maker, this local person. But with the other museums, I think it kind of really varied. At the Horniman, a part of their display was about manufacturing processes and things like that. So it focused on kind of particular companies that make brass band instruments and things like that, rather than the individual instrument maker. The Pitt Rivers, their objects were displays, like the information that was displayed along with them were who the instrument was collected by and where and when, and which kind of led me to believe that they don't know that information, because when they were collected 100, 200 years ago, people didn't think that information was important, so it's kind of been lost. But they kind of tried to add a little bit on the audio guides by kind of giving more general information about instrument manufacturer and how it's used in the original culture. So yeah, it usually, if it is present, it's kind of quite a general, this is how the instrument is made, rather than focusing on the individual instrument maker.
You might, if you continue this work, find interesting a film made by Isuma Productions in Canada, where groups of Inuit were taken to basically the museums in the Washington, D.C. area, mostly the Smithsonian museums, and they looked at collections and talked about them. And
Yeah.
it's incredible, rich material about what the meaning
This
of
is
material
something that I'd really like to do in during my PhD research, or perhaps beyond. I think I'm going to try to shove too much stuff into this. But I think it's a really interesting, especially in the case of these instruments that I want to study, because there's a massive geographical chasm between them, but also a big time difference. They're 5,000 years old. I don't know to what extent these instruments are relevant to contemporary Mexican people. I would like to find that out a lot.
Great.